You're listening to World in Focus on Radio Sputnik. It's 21 minutes past the hour. It remains the worst terrorist attack ever committed in the UK. But will a fresh appeal against the conviction of the only man ever found guilty of the attack bring us any closer to understanding who bombed Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie? Mark Hirst has this extended report.
It remains the worst terrorist attack ever carried out in the UK. But almost 29 years on, and the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over the Scottish town of Lockerbie is still dividing opinion over who was behind the attack. 270 people lost their lives in the 1988 atrocity. Only one man was ever convicted, Libyan national Abdelbaset al Megrahi. In 2001, Megrahi was convicted by a special Scottish court convened in the Netherlands and sentenced to life imprisonment. But doubts remained over the safety of the conviction, with a number of high-profile political and legal figures questioning the verdict and Megrahi's involvement in the attack. In 2009, Megrahi, who maintained his innocence throughout, launched a fresh appeal in an effort to overturn the sentence. A few months earlier, the Libyan was diagnosed with terminal cancer. In August 2009, in a controversial move, the Scottish Government decided to release him on compassionate grounds and return Megrahi to Libya. For reasons that have never been fully explained, shortly before the Scottish Government decision to release him, Megrahi decided to drop his appeal against conviction, although continued to maintain he was innocent. In 2012, just months after the Gaddafi regime was toppled in Libya, Megrahi eventually passed away. But now his family are seeking to relaunch his appeal, hopeful it will restore Megrahi's name and overturn a verdict that has blighted the family and the reputation of Libya for decades. One legal expert who supports the Megrahi family move is Robert Black, Professor Emeritus of Scots Law at the University of Edinburgh. Professor Black is often referred to as the architect of the Camp Zeiss trial, the special Scottish court that was convened in the Netherlands, an idea proposed by Professor Black that helped convince Libya to hand over Megrahi and his co-accused, Lamine Fhimah. Fhimah was ultimately acquitted of any involvement in the attack. Well, Professor Black joins us in the studio now to discuss this further. Professor Black, how common is it for family members to bring an appeal posthumously for a relative who has been convicted of a crime under Scots law? And is the Megrahi family appeal guaranteed to be heard by a Scottish court?
First of all, it is not common at all. I mean, normally applications to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission are made by the convicted person himself. There have been very few indeed that have been made after the death of the person who was actually convicted. So this is very unusual, and there's very little in the way of precedent that can give us a guide as to how either the Criminal Cases Review Commission or the court would be likely to deal with such an application.
Is the appeal guaranteed to be heard?
No, I'm afraid the appeal is not guaranteed to be heard. There are two tests that the Criminal Cases Review Commission has to take into consideration. First, on the basis of its investigation, does the Commission believe that there may have been a miscarriage of justice? That's the first branch of the test. The second branch is, even if there has been a possible miscarriage of justice, is it in the overall interests of justice that a further appeal should take place? So it's this second branch of the test that may cause a difficulty to the Megrahi family. Because after all, there have already been two appeals in the Megrahi case. The first one failed at Camp Zeiss. Then, in 2007, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission thought that there had been a miscarriage or might have been a miscarriage of justice and should be another appeal. But that appeal was abandoned by Abdelbaset Megrahi when he developed untreatable prostate cancer and put in an application for return compassionate release to Libya. And so he abandoned that appeal. So it's possible to envisage that the Criminal Cases Review Commission might say, we're satisfied that there might have been a miscarriage of justice. After all, they decided that in 2007, and considerably more evidence casting doubt on the conviction has arisen since 2007. But, nevertheless, even though there may have been a miscarriage of justice, there have already been two appeals. One failed, one was abandoned. Is it in the interests of justice that Scottish judicial resources should be used for there to be a third bite at this particular cherry.
And there's a lot of questions around why he did drop his second appeal. He was visited shortly before that by the then Scottish Justice Secretary Kenny MacAskill. Do you think there is a direct link between that visit and his decision to drop his appeal? Because he wasn't required to, as I understand.
That's right. I mean, it is not a requirement for compassionate release that any existing appeal should be dropped. However, it is a requirement for prisoner transfer. If a prisoner wishes to serve the remainder of his sentence in a country other than the one he was convicted in this case, if he wanted to serve the remainder of his sentence in Libya, then for such an application to be made, it is necessary that any existing appeal should be abandoned. Now, in the case of Megrahi, there was both an application by the Libyan government for prisoner transfer, and then there was a separate application by Megrahi himself for compassionate release. The latter did not require any appeal to be abandoned, but the former did. Now, Kenny MacAskill, in my view, wrongly and unnecessarily, decided that he would have to consider both applications together. And that therefore meant that if Megrahi wanted to keep extant and open the possibility of prisoner transfer getting him back to Libya, then he had to abandon. And that meant that he abandoned it as well, because Kenny MacAskill, in the case of compassionate release, because Kenny MacAskill said, I must treat them together. I will treat them together. That was legally unnecessary, but it was Kenny's decision.
And although 25 UK-based relatives of victims of the Pan Am 103 bombing are supporting the Megrahi family, many in the US are strongly opposed. Why do you think there's such a stark divide between the US and UK families when it comes to the question of Megrahi's guilt?
That's a very interesting question. I think part of it may be a tendency on the part of American citizens to have more faith in their government and their institutions of government than British subjects, British citizens tend to do. I think many Americans say, if our government has decided that a particular person or a particular country was responsible for a particular atrocity, then we are prepared to trust the government not to mislead us in that regard. I think in Britain we are perhaps less willing to take that view, to automatically trust what our government tells us.
And Megrahi passed away with the conviction still hanging over him in 2012. Why have the family waited until this point to bring a fresh effort to clear his name?
I think part of the difficulty that they have experienced has simply been events in Libya in 2011 onwards. The collapse of the Gaddafi regime and the fact that really there was no viable government of the whole of Libya. Even today, I think, there are parts of Libya that are not under the control of either of the recognised Libyan governments. And so I think the Megrahi family, very wisely, in that situation, in that fluid situation in Libya, decided that discretion was the better part of valour and kept their heads down.
And finally, if this conviction is overturned, it will leave a lot of reputations in tatters. Overturning the conviction would send a shockwave through the Scottish criminal justice system, as well as the governments of Scotland, the UK and US, who have strongly stood by the conviction of Megrahi. Realistically, given those high stakes, how optimistic are you that the conviction will be overturned, and what consequences might that lead to both here and in the US?
I am reasonably confident that if a further appeal takes place as a result of the Megrahi family's application to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission, I am reasonably optimistic that the conviction of Abdelbaset Megrahi will be overturned. And it is interesting that the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission in 2007, on an absolutely crucial point relative to the conviction of Megrahi, the Criminal Cases Review Commission said no reasonable court on that evidence could have reached the conclusion that the Zeist court reached. It's as serious as that. And this is an official body, the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission. This is not conspiracy theorists. This is an official government body set up to investigate possible miscarriages of justice, say that no reasonable court in the Megrahi case could, on a crucial point, have reached the decision that the trial court reached.
Professor Robert Black, very insightful. Many thanks for joining us again on World in Focus. Well, earlier I spoke to Richard Marquise. Mr. Marquise was the FBI's senior investigating officer who oversaw the US aspect of the investigation and has long believed the conviction against Megrahi is the correct one. And 25 UK-based relatives who lost family members in the atrocity have given their backing to this appeal by the Megrahi family in terms of it going forward. Among the US relatives, there is quite clearly open hostility to this latest development. Why do you think the question over Megrahi's guilt or innocence has differed so much between the UK and US relatives?
To me, it's very difficult to say, but I will tell you that when I look back to when the trial occurred, I don't know that there was a lot of bad publicity in Europe over the trial, the conduct of the trial. I read some of the news stories that were published in what I would call tabloids, particularly in England, but in the UK, that were very negative about the Crown, negative about the trial. I don't think that same reporting took place in the United States. And quite frankly, I don't think that the trial was covered like it deserved, because it was one of the biggest terrorist attacks in history up to that point. It was very, very significant. And I really have no way of knowing specifically, because I don't know many of the UK relatives. I know mostly of them. But I think that there may be more trust of institutions, of government, maybe of law enforcement, of intelligence agencies. It's very difficult for me to say, and I don't know what's in everybody's heart. I haven't talked to any of the relatives here in the United States since this latest appeal, but that's a tough answer to that question. But I honestly don't know why there's such a big difference.
And in your view, when it comes to the evidence against Megrahi, what aspect of the case represents for you the smoking gun that links the Libyan directly to this attack?
Well, I guess I'm going to sort of just make this as a point-by-point topic. First of all, the Libyan government had a motive, and you can make the case that the Iranians also had a motive because of the USS Vincennes. But I don't think it should ever be forgotten that Muammar Gaddafi did not like Ronald Reagan. This attack took place about 1 month before Reagan left office. And we know from intelligence information that the Libyans were looking to carry out an attack. They had operatives in the United States that had been stifled and stopped by the FBI from carrying out attacks within our country. This was his last chance. Well, Megrahi himself was a member of the Libyan intelligence service. He was in Malta on December the 8th, the day that we assessed, based on all the information and interviews with Tony Gauci from Mary's house, we believe that the clothing was purchased on December the 8th. We later would find out that Megrahi was there on that day. Megrahi was identified by Tony Gauci after he looked at dozens of photographs. He said if this person was a little bit, I don't remember now whether it was older or younger, but he said he resembled him. I realize that was not a strong indictment, but he said he resembled him. Megrahi had ties to Mebo, the company that made the timer that was found in the wreckage of Pan Am 103. Megrahi was in Malta on December 20th and 21st. He was only there for about 12 hours. He came there with a false passport. Even this he denied when he was later interviewed by Pierre Salinger. His trip in and trip out, he traveled with a gentleman by the name of Abu Aguila Masood. This name did not come up at the trial, or that it was very briefly discussed. But if you or anybody that listens to your program has seen Ken Dornstein's report entitled My Brother's Bomber, which was on American Public Broadcasting, a 3-part series, he really did an incredible job of bringing out Masood's connections to Megrahi. Megrahi and Masood had traveled together previously. There is good information that Massoud was involved as the bomb maker for the LaBelle disco bombing in Germany in 1986. And he traveled out with Megrahi on the morning of the 21st, and we believe that he was the person that actually armed the Lockerbie bomb. You've got Megrahi connected to FEMA because we believe FEMA picked him up, FEMA picked Megrahi up at the hotel and drove him to the airport. FEMA would have been able to have gotten the bag beyond security without it being checked.
I should point out at this point, Lima FEMA was acquitted of any involvement in the bombing, but you still believe that he had some involvement. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I'm convinced, whether knowingly or unknowingly, I don't know the answer to that. But FEMA had a diary entry that said get luggage tags from Air Malta. Number one, Libyans were not allowed to get luggage tags from Air Malta. They were not allowed to tag bags in that airport. And for whatever the reason, and if you look at books written by John Ashton and Ian Ferguson, and you look at claims made by Megrahi, there's about 14 different reasons why they were getting luggage tags. From we never got luggage tags to, well, we were going to go into luggage making business to some other. There's been at least 3 or 4 different reasons why these luggage tags were being obtained. But we believe that he obtained those luggage tags and put those on the bag. Those, to me, are strong circumstantial. That makes a strong circumstantial case to say that Megrahi was at least involved in purchasing clothing connected to the company that made the timers and getting the bag onto the aircraft. Was he the only one? No, there were other people that were involved in this in the Libyan hierarchy, some of whom have been killed by Gaddafi and some of whom have died. Others have been killed by some of the rebels currently active in Libya.
And 9 months ago, the new Scottish Secretary, Michael Matheson, told us that a second arrest in connection with the bombing was about to be made. So far, there has been no additional arrests made by the Scottish police. How likely is it, in your view, that other individuals will end up being convicted in connection with the bombing of Pan Am 103?
Well, I'm guessing that second arrest that was predicted or suggested was probably Abu Aghil and Massoud. I just don't know of any other people that were in the frame. If I were to go back and look at it, and there were about 8 or 10, I don't remember the number anymore, but there were about 8 or 10 people that we had in the frame that we felt probably had some connection. And of course, our hope back 20-some years ago was that one of these people would come into our purview, we could interview them, they would flip, to use a law enforcement term, and they would tell us what happened, and we'd be able to indict and eventually convict other people. There's a big reality of trying to put together another trial team when there have been witnesses who have died, witnesses that may no longer be available, witnesses that could no longer testify. I think an additional conviction, at least with a trial, would be very, very difficult. And I think it would probably take somebody confessing. But I think a trial, to having to prove all your evidence again, would be, not saying impossible, but I think it would be very, very, very difficult.
Well, Richard Marquise, many thanks for speaking to us today on World in Focus.
You're welcome, Mark. Have a good day.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.